Hey everyone, welcome to our DevOps office hours. It's October 5th, 2022. My name's Eric Osterman, and I'll be leading the conversation. I'm the founder and CEO of Cloud Posse. We are a DevOps accelerator, which just means that we help companies who want to own their infrastructure to build it in record time using some of our Terraform blueprints for AWS. Along the journey, your team will get leveled up on how to build modern infrastructure, and along with it, all the design decisions that you need to consider. To hire us, just head over to cloudposse.com/quiz. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz. For those of you new to the call, the format is very informal. My goal is to get your questions answered. So feel free to unmute yourself at any time if you want to jump in and participate. If you're tuning in from our podcast or YouTube channel, you can register for these live and interactive sessions by heading over to cloudposse.com/officehours. Again, that's cloudposse.com/officehours. We host these calls every week. Our call today is recorded. We'll automatically post a recording of our session to our YouTube channel. So if you enjoy the content and want to support what we do over here, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. It helps us out a great deal. So with that said, let's kick this off. I got a few announcements that have come across my desk. First to note is that I don't really have any HashiConf announcements. I guess we'll recap those next week once they're all in. So if you are in Los Angeles, HashiConf is going on this week. Today is the second day of the conference, and there'll be a lot of good announcements coming out for the flagship products like Vault, Console, Terraform, and so forth. Anybody here on the call in Los Angeles going to HashiConf? If so, hit me up on Slack. It'd be great to meet up. I just met Luke, co-creator of Atlantis, and that was really cool. GitHub action for Terratest. Yeah, so we are going to be open sourcing a bunch of smaller composable actions as part of a strategy that we're implementing for one of our customers to do a comprehensive CICD implementation with GitHub actions for Terraform, specifically Atmos, but it would translate to Terraform as well. So as part of this, what does the CI story look like for testing modules, for testing root modules with Terratest? How does that work in poly repos or mono repos? How do you clean up after those runs? If you do testing with Terraform, one thing to be aware of: when it crashes, it orphans a lot of resources frequently, so you need to have cleanups afterwards, nuking, for example. So having test automation accounts is a good idea. Other things that we're focused on is a comprehensive continuous delivery strategy with Terraform. It's non-trivial to do it the right way with GitHub Actions. We're talking using GitHub environments, using approval steps within GitHub, using environment protection rules, ordered dependencies, smoke tests, and the list goes on and on. So keep an eye out for what we're working there on our GitHub action strategy. Any questions on this before I go on to the next one? All right. Next announcement, just a little tool I saw pop up. I think there's other ones like this. This one is a tool to help you identify where your child modules and providers are not using the latest version. Obviously, you can just run Terraform and hit upgrade, bam, it's upgraded. If you want to take a more pragmatic approach and explore each update and then go check out the release notes or something, then this might be a good way to do that. It's also maybe something that one could throw into a CI pipeline, right? And notify you if there are newer versions of providers, if you want to consider updating those in your pull request. Any questions on this? All right. Okay, this is an exciting one, close to home. We've been developing tons of stuff in Atmos lately. Atmos is our tool for complex workflows around CLI tools. We have an opinionated workflow for Terraform and an opinionated workflow for Helm file, but it really supports any tool under the hood. Atmos has a hierarchical YAML configuration that supports remote imports. Those configurations, though, can get pretty complicated. And in a distributed autonomous team environment, you're going to need to have validation. So we've added support for JSON schema, which is validating just the actual YAML schema itself, and you can have custom policies there to validate the variables. And we've added support for OPA. So OPA is, in this case, not the way everyone else thinks about OPA and Terraform. Most people are using OPA today to validate their Terraform plans themselves. This is shifting left of that. This is introducing OPA at the what we are using as YAML configuration. Think of it like your Terraform var files. There are other tools for like var files, but if you are just using var files everywhere, that doesn't scale when you have hundreds or thousands of root modules deployed across environments. So that's why we have added this natively into Atmos. There's multiple ways to leverage it. You can do it explicitly, calling Atmos validate and the configuration for a component. You can specify or override the policy you want to use, or the strategy, OPA or JSON schema. Or the prescribed way of doing it is you're going to specify first in your Atmos configuration the path where your schemas are located for OPA and JSON schema. And then for your components themselves, you're going to specify which validation rules to leverage. So the outcome of that is you get something like this. So when you run Atmos, it'll check the configuration, the final configuration, because remember, we have this hierarchical configuration that's importing config from all over the place, and tell you if something is valid or not. This is just a proof of concept example of an OPA policy. They can be a lot more complicated than this. Example policies is we don't want to have these two root modules ever deployed in the same account. Or in this account, we never want to use EKS clusters. It should only be using ECS. In this account, obviously you can do some of these things using service control policies, but it is nice when you shift things left a little bit more early, because you get the update in your CI pipelines faster. Also, modern editors support JSON schema and OPA, so you can get some of these validations maybe in VS Code if you're using it, though I don't think we've personally validated that yet, since we just cut this release this week. Any questions on our policy implementation or the use case or why it's there?
Yeah, I got one question for you, and I've seen a whole bunch of vendors move down this road in whatever they're doing with their products as well. One of the big questions and one of the big challenges I think that would come up is, how do you track or prevent changes? So you've now got a policy that says in account X, don't use EKS. But now, because the developer has access to the repo, they can now override that policy. So how do you, what security controls do you have in place to prevent those policies from being overwritten at developer runtime?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. So just to highlight, get out of this here. So for example, there will be this file like this, DAX schemas, OPA validate, infra VPC component rego.
Sorry, Eric, can you just briefly restate the question?
Yeah, so basically it's the fox guarding the chicken coop is the concern. So if you have this mono repo and you have your policies in the repo and you got the code that it applies to, what is preventing the developer from just modifying the rego policy or deleting it altogether and getting that merged and bypassing it entirely? It's a great question, and it is addressed. Let me talk about that. So the first thing is, if you're not on GitHub, you're on your own. I only know GitHub. Many of the other platforms support similar things. as with all things in security, it comes in layers and different controls. The first control is you will put a code owners on your schemas themselves. So a team like the SecOps team or some other team that would be responsible for managing them. Standard policy driven control. That prevents the manipulation of the policy itself. We have one more problem. What if somebody is modifying the configuration itself and then just deletes this here and says, hey, I don't want that validation, it doesn't serve me. Well, what you would do in this case is you would need to have a separate action that's mandatory and it prevents merging of a pull request if it fails. And that action is verifying that that pull request is not deleting any of the policies that have been configured for this stack. So the combination of those two would prevent merging of a pull request that disables the policy controls unless specific people approve the pull request.
And you spoke there for a quick second about the code owner or the repo owner or the SecOps owner of the whoever owns the policies. How do you, in a large organization where there's prone to be change, update that to be more generic? So if there's a change in the org, like the SecOps leader or the CISO left and you've got a new CISO that's joined,
Yeah.
do you now have to manually go in, or do you have some integration that plugs into something like the HR platform, like Bamboo HR or something that would then update that from?
But yeah, so I get your valid point. And the concern there is two. One is like, well, imagine a large enterprise organization. You have lots of infrastructure repositories leveraging this strategy of stack configs and OPA policies and so forth. How are you going to manage that? Well, I guess it a little bit depends on how you're managing GitHub. So this is not a problem unique to what we're doing. This is a fundamental organizational problem of how you're managing code owners. That aside, you would use teams, and those teams shouldn't be changing frequently in your organization. For example, here we're using an engineering team. So the participation in a team, I'm not sure exactly how that works on the SSO side. I'm not versed on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a way to add or remove people to those teams.
Yeah, I was about to just say on the enterprise side of that is when you have single sign-on through your IDP, you basically use attributes that come from your directory, and that can be Bamboo HR, or it can be Active Directory, or it can be whatever the source of truth is of who the members are in your company and what their roles and titles are. You would use attributes coming from there to determine which GitHub groups they end up belonging to. And then this essentially is the thing that ties, the code to the GitHub groups, as Eric was alluding to.
Yeah, spot on.
Yeah, awesome.
So, for anyone else interested, the reason why we are doing a lot of these is it is for a major financial institution that is adopting some of this tooling in how they use Terraform. So that's why we're introducing all of these policy controls and more advanced features of Atmos that serve like an enterprise audience. Still open source. All right. Next feature. Yeah, Vlad shared that the actual DORA report, not just the call for respondents, has come out summarizing it. I just saw it this morning. I haven't had a chance to take a look at it. I don't know if Vlad's on the line here today. We got you, Vlad. Doesn't look like it. Anybody read it already? Any highlights you want to point out?
I also only saw it this morning, so haven't read it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be digesting that next week, maybe when I'm back from HashiConf. So just be advised, it's there. If you look in the Slack channel, there's a link to the.
So I actually, surprisingly, I have a question about assessing the relative value and importance outside of like just my own opinions of something like the State of DevOps report. So in other words, you know, I actually have read portions of previous year's reports, not just DORA's, but also other DevOps reports. But it's not something I'm like super versed in or anything like that. So I'd like to get just opinions on how in parity is the information here. And I mean, granted, this is coming from directors and, you know, leaders and whatever. So I'm going to assume it's fairly in keeping with what, you know, a good DevOps engineer actually thinks is important. But I'm just curious, like, what are people's opinions on, you know, the level of which, yes, this thing is absolutely hitting on stuff that are big concerns for us, or this is sort of like corporate thinking that's kind of super big picture and not really relevant to my day-to-day stuff. Like, where does it fall in the spectrum of that stuff? Like, is this critical stuff, or is it sort of useful, or like, how does that shake out for people?
Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that if you look at reports that come from some of the other organizations out there, the Gartners and Forresters of the world, some of those tend to be more aspirational and, you know, pie in the sky, and here's where we think the industry is going and moving and all of those kind of things. I think that specifically this State of DevOps report is more reflectional of like actual organizations being surveyed and what they're saying is occurring currently in their organization and what's important to them now. So I think it's probably a little bit more tied to reality than some of the analyst reports that you'll get that are saying like in 2024 this is where the industry is going to be, even though they do touch, you know, on some future things in these reports. But I think this is much more around kind of what people are doing today, what they're concerned with, and what they're spending their time on, like over the last 12 months while they collected all this information, kind of thing. So I think this one in particular is more relevant, and probably you should pay a little bit more attention to it if there are things that resonate with you and seem to be like lining up with what you're doing. A lot of their solutioning and where they're spending time and how they're resourcing and those types of things are probably pretty spot on, like across a lot of different industries. So hopefully that answers kind of what you were getting at. But
Yeah,
you know, I don't know that there's a definitive answer, but that's my opinion on these reports.
No, I was just looking for some nuance there besides the obvious, like it's a report, it's decent, read it. So I think, you help.
If you're looking at like some elements of this report and you look at over the last 12 months and you as an org haven't been impacted by some of the stuff that's evented, and I'm thinking of like the NPM JS supply chain attacks, I'm thinking Log4j. I mean, those things have been shared with and talked to death with, and I don't want to go into them in any specific form or formality. But if your org and what you're doing haven't been impacted by any of those events, I don't know how you're doing what you're doing without being impacted by some of the events that are being talked about in these reports about what people are focusing on, where they're changing their focus, how they're trying to apply different variants of shift left. And again, this might be Google's version of the DevOps state of DevOps report, or state of the nation reports, as I call them. And you're going to have a couple of these come from different orgs, but most of them are going to talk about last 12 months and what you're going to try and look forward into, how you're going to try and potentially see increases in specific scenarios. And I've always looked at these as these are areas where we have security concerns and where I'd like to invest some of my organization or my team's time into improving our security stances in specific areas that might be, and I use some of these reports and I actually share them with our senior leadership to show where I'm getting my data from and what the real risks are.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess use them if they help you. Otherwise, don't worry about it. All right, so the next notification, I think somebody shared it in the office hours channel, was that now you can set the default instance metadata service version to 2, or rather that is now the default for AMIs. If you're not familiar with the difference between V1 and V2 of IMDS, which is the kind of introspection service in AWS, you can curl it and get data back based on the context of your EC2 instance running in AWS. Earlier versions of this didn't require it to be a post request, and you could basically exfiltrate sensitive credentials like the STS credentials out if the EC2 instance had those. With IMDS v2, that's not possible, and there's no excuse for not using it these days. Anything that uses the AWS SDK supports it out of the box, and therefore, this is a good news. All right. Then last one was just, I hadn't heard of it, didn't know about it, but it's GA now. Amazon's file cache service. You can set it in front of network file storage systems like EFS or FSX, or even your on-prem systems, and it'll locally cache data with higher throughput and lower latency. More than that, I don't know about it. Has anybody already looked into it? I'd like to learn more about it, just briefly. For example, I'm guessing it's not POSIX compliant. I'm guessing it's an API endpoint rather. All right, that's it. Let's get into Q&A. Jonas, you were very active this week, stirring, kicking the hornet's nest, saying, "What the heck is all this infrastructure as code doing in my monitoring?" No, I'm joking. Let me open up the question here and change my screen share to that window here.
Yeah, so I think it would be, do you mind if I just state it? Because that's sort of like, what do you call it? Stream of consciousness there, right? So I've actually thought a lot about this.
Okay.
So I think I have it filed down to like a real succinct kind of question here. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Basically, the question is this: what priority should there be, if any, on getting specifically, and this is, I think, the key thing to understand here about what I'm asking about, specifically monitors, alerts, synthetics, dashboards, things of that nature, that part of the observability layer, not instance configuration, not IAM, not SCIM, not other security aspects, nothing like that. None of the core configuration stuff. I don't think there's really debate about that. But what level of priority should be assigned to getting monitors, dashboards, things of this nature into some type of code, whether it be a CDK or a IAC or something? What level of priority should there be there? And let me make a couple caveats here as well. So I've already stated that the question is not about like core configuration type stuff, right? So the reason that I'm asking this, and then I'll just want to hit like a couple of the reasons that I think are really basic. So I just want to clear away a lot of the stuff that people might bring up initially. So the reason why I'm bringing this up in the first place is because, and the tool is not important, but I was digging into some observability work at my shop, and I used a tool called Terraformer, which turns SAS objects into Terraform. You basically just hit enter and this thing terraforms all your SaaS objects for SaaSes that it knows about. So it has pre-canned API workflows where it gets JSON responses and it turns that JSON into HCL, and there you go. So within like 20 minutes, I found myself with hundreds of Terraform dashboards, hundreds, if not soon to be thousands of Terraform monitors, hundreds of Terraform synthetics, right? So all of a sudden I had all this observability as code. And right at that moment, it dawned on me that there was a bunch of work that I was going to need to do to really, initially it was exciting, but then I started realizing, okay, I need to map all of this back to service owners. I need to get everybody to tell me, like, is this critical? Can this be blown away? Whatever. So anyway, long story short, when faced now with this sudden proposition of like, okay, I've got everything in code, like how much do I actually care about this? So I started asking around, and this is what I found. Some people actually have the experience to sort of say, yeah, I've done this, I've done it enough, I've done it at scale, I have like an opinion about this and it's based in experience. What I also found though was a lot of people that I was talking to, whether it be at work, here in the Cloud Posse chat, in the Datadog chat, because that's the observability stack I use, or on LinkedIn, I spoke to a bunch of people on there as well. We're sort of coming at it from just like a mainstream opinion type thing, like, yeah, this is sort of, this would be cool, right? So kind of these two groups. So this is the last thing I'll say. The reasons that people are saying that this layer of observability, monitors, dashboards, things of this nature, not core configuration, but that other stuff should be in code. The reasons they give are, number one, reusability. So you get everything in code, and then all of a sudden, you know, people can kind of copy pasta stuff into new services, change it how they need, Terraform plan apply, you're good to go. Number two, auditing. So, you know, if somebody makes a change that screws up a monitor, an alert, a dashboard, whatever, you go into source control, you can figure out, I guess who, but more importantly, when and why that happened. Number three, establishing best practices, right? So basically, teams' good observability bubbles up throughout the organization. Is like, hey, these people have really great dashboards. If you're a new service, you should go and look at their stuff and copy it and go from there. Easier compliance, so you can label stuff with tags and do like automated cleanup and start to kind of, you know, flesh out which dashboards are critical, which dashboards can go away, stuff like that. Potential cost savings based on cleanup and kind of metadata control. Backup and disaster recovery. So now here's a fact. So Datadog, just speaking for Datadog, it's probably the same across all of them. They only back up dashboards for 30 days. In terms of like actual config, they don't back anything else up. Like it's kind of hand wavy, but there's no SLA against, like, if you accidentally like blow away 100 monitors, like you can't get them back. And then finally, consistency, right? So basically, for better or for worse, you're getting sort of the same types of approaches and methodologies in terms of doing monitoring and dashboards and all that stuff. And maybe it makes it easier to iterate. So that's the whole shebang. I think that's enough to really get a juicy discussion going on. Granted, I could make counters to a lot of this stuff, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to. But it is the counters that sort of had me questioning the use of this in the first place. So just to reiterate, the question is, what's the priority? Not like, should all this, you know, it's literally just, what is the priority? It's probably, is it day zero? Like, and also, you know, do you have other reasons that I didn't cover for why this is valuable? Okay, thanks for letting me talk. Appreciate any feedback.
Yeah, that was a great introduction to the problem, Jonas. Before we get into answering it, I know we have a lot of us are chomping at the bit to do that. Anybody have questions about the question before we get into answering the question?
Yeah, thank you. Because what I've been finding is when people are responding, they're saying stuff that's not really, like, they're kind of like, da, 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 and it's sort of like, yeah, it's not what's being asked.
Which you just said, right? Yeah.
Sorry,
That was
I
a
missed the
lot, so
question.
we
Could
could
you
almost benefit from slides on that one, but
Matt, okay, Matt's making a joke. All
I
right,
was,
that's funny.
I was just joking. I said I missed the question. Could you repeat it?
Good. That well, so my job is done. Then it got in there. All right.
I was kidding.
So first, just you know, empathy. That was the realization I came to when we went down this journey at Cloud Posse, terraforming Datadog and Opsgenie, what we found was just too few. What I found, at least, was too few companies do it, have a concerted strategy for how to do it. And it's largely because they're probably sitting at the point you're at, like, dude, we already have a bunch of this stuff in here. I just need to get this stuff done. We need to move fast, move on. And you do it with ClickOps. It's the fastest way to get things out there. So that's what I found by and large. When I try to get a concrete strategy for how to do it, I find a lot of philosophy, a lot of like the philosophy of SRE, and that you should use SLIs and SLOs and all of that stuff. And that we really struggled with a lot at Cloud Posse, getting past that to a tactical implementation that is described in Terraform. Jumping to the chase, we got there, we implemented it. But there are pros and cons with it. So
yeah, and I should say, Eric, let me just interject. So just so people understand, I do have direct experience terraforming observability of this nature. So in fact, as Eric knows, both Andre and myself, Andre is one of Eric's guys, coded up a bunch of observability in using Atmos and Terraform previously. So I have direct experience doing this, just not at the scale that I'm discussing now. Back then, it was like, we didn't have anything. So it was like, oh, this is a no-brainer, but it was a trivial use case. Now we're talking an entire enterprise. So just to put that in context.
Yeah, so the priority question, I think, is key here. So like, if you're just getting off the ground and your team's relatively small, you maybe don't have a budget or the resources to dedicate to this. I mean, let there be no doubt that if you want to go down this route, doing observability as code for an enterprise, this is, first of all, there needs to be a team that owns the strategy and the abstractions and the processes, and then delegates or teaches that to the rest of the organization. Otherwise, it's just going to be a hodgepodge, inconsistently tagged, inconsistent standards, and so forth. So sounds like your organization is much farther along, and they're not at like the early stages of implementing this. If you have hundreds of monitors and dashboards and synthetics at this point, it's a good time to reevaluate if you want to continue double down on that, or introduce some standards. So
right, that's the question.
Yeah.
That's the question.
So now
you're there and you've got it in Terraform. Do you care, or is it enough to say, you know what, look, things are pretty good. Like, do we actually care? Like, what would we gain by like? Is it a pain point? Exactly. Like, you know what I'm saying? And that's sort of the thing that I couldn't get from the community, is people are like, yeah. And it's like, why? And they're like, well, I don't know. I've never really done that. So.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, I just want to ask one question. And this is more on the implementation side of it at the minute for you. Do you have either an area of pain points that you're hitting that you have minimal visibility over, number one, or do you have the opposite, where you've got a bunch of alerts and potentially creating alert fatigue by having a bunch of alerts that are actually irrelevant? And I think that's probably going to guide a bunch of the conversation that you need to have as well.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I can succinctly answer that by saying, just answering both at the same time. Kind of like, I don't know, medium to both your, I mean, do we have spam? Yeah, there's spam. Could that be improved? Yeah. Is it like, first day type stuff where it's just all noise? No, it isn't. And at the same time, the thing is, I think one of the things that makes this tricky and why I'm really having a hard time answering this is because the shop that I'm currently at happens to be entirely serverless. So the DevOps team is not like a centralized gatekeeping team, right? So all of the development teams are fairly empowered. So as to the question of like, what's the veracity of their observability, I would say medium. And like, do I feel like there needs to be a bunch of control exerted over that? No. At the same time, when I tell people, hey, magically all your dashboards and monitors are Terraform, they're like, holy F, that's amazing. Like, please put them in our repo. So I mean, it's the answer to your question is kind of like, I don't know, not really,
So I want to address the Terraformer approach that this is tantamount to disassembly, right?
Yeah.
You can disassemble a program and look, it's all in code. And some of these disassemblers have gotten pretty good, but it's not the code that you or I would write if it was Terraform. It's not the code you or I would want to be maintaining long-term. So just like you could get it into Terraformer, and then that's why I said in your message earlier, that covers the BCP and the DR side, but that's not your concern really right now.
Oh, that's what you meant. I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. So then you have a backup of it, you can restore it, but it's not what I would like to be managing at scale, is, 500 resources, defined.
I
Well,
have a couple
I mean,
of insights.
those would be, yeah, just to offer some, extension there. I mean, it's not a monorepo, right? I mean, so the first part is basically parsing all of those out into the services. So I have an Excel spreadsheet that's kind of tracking like who owns what, right? So with all of this observability, it would all be sending it back home to mom, right? Basically, which service owns it, blah, 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 blah. So it would be starting from there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a couple of things from my experience working in some large organizations that I'll just bring up, which may or may not be applicable. But one of the organizations that I did some extensive work with had people who frequently moved teams, or worked, moved which services they worked on, and whether it be every 6 months or at least, every annual cycle, people could elect to move to a different team working on something else. And the more standardization there was, and those people also participated in on-call rotations and support of those of the services that they were responsible for running. And the more standardization that there is in the observability stack, as you move from service to service and from team to team, the less friction there is in someone ramping up on their new service and understanding what they can expect. It's sort of like an SLA for what to expect for like each of your services. So like you're monitoring all the same core metrics in the same way.
Right.
They're showing up on the same dashboards in the same places, etc. And then that particular thing also becomes really important if you're doing any kind of roll-ups to some sort of a higher level, dashboard or tool set or those kind of things. And especially if the roll-ups are in a fluid motion. Like I've worked with some things where they're trying to restructure divisions and groups that at a higher level, and that's what they're trying to take a look at, like all the e-commerce services. But then they decide that, well, they only want like this certain retail e-commerce service, and then they redo like a bunch of dashboards. And if the data that they're working with to do those aggregations and roll-ups aren't all sort of standardized, it makes those jobs almost impossible. And I think the last thing I'll say is that if you do any kind of like acquisitions, having a framework where you can pick up your acquisition and just drop your framework on top of them and be like, here, plug into our standardized framework for monitoring. Let me turn these things on for you, ... Now you can pick those things up. I worked for an organization that did tons and tons of acquisitions, and getting those new services onboarded and et cetera became a lot easier when we had standardization around those things and just had like plug and play versions of our observability tooling out there. So
yeah, thank you, man. I'm glad you chimed in, man.
And I have one last.
I knew you'd have. Okay.
And the one last one I have is just if you're doing, especially on the on like logging and auditing and those kinds of things, if you have any kind of compliance frameworks that you're trying to adhere to, making the demonstrable or the demonstrable evidence that you're meeting the things that you have laid out for the compliance frameworks in all of these different services also becomes much easier when it's a standardized set of things that you have and can deploy in a very easy way. And then finally, I do have one more. Finally, if you decide across the board that you have any, you want to make any changes, like you've decided because after a lot of wisdom that like CPU utilization isn't actually like a good indicator of the health of your services. I'm just throwing something random out there. Like either turning that off or tweaking that or de-emphasizing the importance of that in your dashboards or in your alerting framework becomes really, really hard when you have to go across hundreds or thousands of services and do that manually. But it's really easy to do when you have that defined as code.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
there's all my answers. I have no more.
Yeah. No, that was so there you go, Eric. Matt, he's demonstrating value. No, I think that was really elite for doing that on the spot like that. I had 48 hours to kind of think about it. And I arrived at all those conclusions too. So the fact that you're sort of just innately arriving at those in your experience is really reassuring to me. So let me just as a last measure here, and if other people want to chime in on this, let me now extend this, Eric. Let me now take this into hyperspace here, if you will. So basically what I'm starting to think about now is I was sitting there and I was looking and I was like, you know what? You know what I could do? I could write some Lambda functions that would basically function as a scraper and a reconciler, like against Datadog. So basically, if you think about, right, and now granted, Matt Gowie offensively referred to this as a poor man's reconciler on LinkedIn, but I clap back big time. But anyway, poor man's or not, I think there's nothing really that covers this that I've seen, with the exception of the abstraction layer, Eric, that I know at some point you probably, yeah, you already mentioned it once, but that's a whole other, I think, you know,
I'm biting my tongue. That's all.
I know, I'm sure you are. But so I think you guys probably get where I'm headed here, which is that you have a function that, you know, you run a Lambda on a schedule that says, look, you know, Terraformer, all my Datadog stuff, you know, and then look for diffs based on what's in the repos. And, you know, then, you know, do reconciliation plans and, you know, post those to a Slack bot or to a Jira ticket or whatever, right? And just do this every night. You know what I'm saying? I'm listening, Matt.
Or even easier, just turn off write access for all your users except for your automation user.
And yeah, and see, that's also, and that's a definitely useful debate, but it's like, I don't want to do that. Like, first of all, nobody should be responsible for coding dashboards. Like that is just a nightmare. Like that's one thing people, you don't think so, Matt? Okay. I think I think that, you know, doing JSON arithmetic starts to get kind of ridiculous after a while, right? Like that's, I don't think something that people should be wasting time with. Being able to go into the UI and just spin up a bunch of wacky dashboards is something that I want to extend to people. But if you feel differently, yeah, you know.
Oh, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a development function that's allowed to do that, but I'm just saying like that shouldn't be the way that anyone implements that for your production services.
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm right there with you. So now, Eric, so I guess this is the poor man's versus abstraction layer time. So basically, I see that, you know, as kind of a MVP. You know what I'm saying? For letting people do stuff and then reconciling it and then offering them plans and some sort of tracking, auditing through Slack or Jira or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So
can I throw back a question to you? Like,
yes, yeah,
how many, if you have 1,000 services, I'm just throwing out a number, I don't know what the number is, how many unique permutations of dashboards do you actually believe you have or should have for those?
Yeah, that's the thing is you start cat herding through this stuff, you start realizing like, all right, 1 out of every 10 of these things is even useful, let alone, you know, how many of these are actually critical. So that's the work. And to your point, Matt, I think the next step is kind of this sort of bubbling up of the patterns of like, yeah, you know what, like turns out there's only 3 types of mega dashboards that all these different services even really need to be making. You know what I mean? So, you know, everybody doing, you know, the dashboard dance probably isn't even useful.
So in terms of prioritization, going back to that though, I think that these things don't need to be mutually exclusive, and you can think of it like test coverage or code coverage. So in this case, your infrastructure as code coverage is 0. You might want to start driving that up and establishing the baselines with whatever strategy you're doing. There'll always be some percentage of these that are custom hand tailored. And then you can track it, how well that's going. Is that number going up or down? I personally, well, I'll just caution, we all do it. I'm an engineer, just trying to call you out on it. I kind of feel like you have a solution in mind and you're looking for justification for implementing it that way versus looking at, what consistent patterns are for doing what you want to do. What you're talking about is just drift detection and reconciliation. Those are patterns built into Pulumi and Terraform Cloud and Spacelift. You need to make sure as an organization, you have the maturity to be able to do that. And you can solve this as a one-off for SRE and what you're doing on the monitoring side. You can try and solve it more generally if you're going to adopt infrastructure as code across the org. And if you're going to do the latter, I would look at first, like coming up with that and use SRE as your first use case of it.
Right, but okay, so okay, last point here, since I think this was good, but I also hogged it. So there's 13 minutes left, so I want to make sure other people get a chance to jump in. But just one counterpoint to that, like, you're right about the solution looking for a problem thing. Like, I hear you there, and yeah, I actually need to discuss that with management, because I could totally let go of my Rube Goldberg machine. Like, I can let go of that, right? But how trivial, not trivial, but how much effort will it take to arrive at, like, so like I can use the 4 golden signals, right? And I can use DORA, not the report, but the literal DORA metrics, right? As a baseline starter, and I can sort of comb through the services and figure out, like, okay, who's doing DORA, who's got 4 golden signals, like probably nobody. It's not, and then start to offer like templatized things and transition people over to that. Like, yes, I could do that. I could standardize things in that way. You know what I'm saying? I could also do some cat herding and get everybody terraformed in probably 2 weeks, and at least start with that. So
if I would make an argument that if you terraformed everything and you got for every service that you got latency, traffic, error rate, and resource saturation dashboards, which are the 4 golden signals that we were talking about, you would be in a far better shape than having hundreds or 1,000 dashboards that have all these esoteric metrics and can't really tell you like what the state of your service is without like looking on 7 different pages and all that craziness there.
Yeah, but
and
so
just
again,
on top of just on top of that, if you already have a bunch of these metrics in your Datadog, are you also exporting your Datadog to S3 so that when you start reducing your metrics or your dashboards to your core dashboard that you want to have, your core visibility per service, that you can still within historically, like with S3 logs, be able to track some of the other metrics as they're phased out or being made redundant within Datadog's retention, so that you have a longer retention of your data for extended visibility to see whether that metric actually made an impact.
So I can speak for logs, and the answer is we're headed in the opposite direction. And for metrics, I couldn't answer that. But so thank you for that. That's a point I hadn't even considered. But Matt, my question for you is, you talk about like 100, 1,000 services, right? Like, do you think in an organization with 1,000 services that you're going to not find a case of like, well, hey, like we need custom metrics, or like we actually, like, we're going to need something different than basically the implication being that like errors, latencies, saturation, all this other stuff is just like the whole shebang. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So organizations that are as large as, Google and Facebook and Netflix and whatever have come to the realization after spending, hundreds of thousands of engineering hours that those are the things that actually matter to service availability, that error budgeting, like around all those things. you're somewhat making the snowflake argument, and it's like, you know, we're different, this is different, I'm different, my organization is different, my service is different. It probably isn't. Like when you boil it down there, you know, and that's just, you know, I'm being somewhat, you know, controversial about it, but people always make that, you know, well, I just need ... And when you boil it down, the reason they don't need it is either they're not defining those 4 metrics the proper way, or they're doing something that doesn't make sense. Like, you know,
Okay, so
to manage it.
yeah, no, that's fine. I'm impervious, nearly impervious to professional insight. So it sounds like you're, so just to end it here, thank you very much. Just a ton of gratitude. You're saying basically, if I were to really deep dive their metrics, that I would find out that they're not hitting what they should be. Most of the stuff can be cleared away. And if we really just got on track with covering, you know, the core bases, that would cover 98% of all problems. Like, that's what I hear you
I
implying.
think,
Yeah.
Okay.
It's going to tell you how healthy your service is and whether you need to go fix something. And that's really what you want out of your observability platform.
All right.
You should
Excellent.
probably get your platform in shape first to do deployments, and then use that information that you start getting to be able to just deploy, you know, the updates to the stats and things like that. You know, I wanted to make a couple really quick comments. When you expose config to the users, boil it down to as little as you can. I use YAML files with maybe 10. You can add more, you know, variables to populate each monitor. And
Jonas has worked on that.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, I've done the. Yeah, I totally empathize with you, man. I'm right there with you. Yep, definitely.
Yeah, and don't forget about Datadog Power Packs. I don't know, I haven't used them much, but they're collections of widgets that can be used across dashboards. I'm looking into how I can use that too.
Cool.
And
I wanted to jump to another question.
Yeah.
Just a
Yeah,
few
please.
areas since we're almost out of time. I think we'll get through some of these pretty quickly. Was this something quick, Eric?
that was it.
Okay, awesome. Dave Gregory, you were asking earlier if it's absolutely true that S3 buckets cannot be moved or transferred between accounts, and I can't find anything to the contrary from personal experience as well, working with our customers. Empathize with the cost of moving assets between buckets. I find it asinine that is not possible as companies acquire other companies or need to consolidate things. And I don't understand what technically is so complicated for S3 to do it. It's got to be not technical. It's got to be some other reason that they're not doing these transfers of buckets. So what we do instead is a couple options. Now, it depends on your business use case. I'll give an example, like where a company has, you know, petabytes of audio files or video files in an S3 bucket or two. It just cost prohibitive to move that relative to the business value of getting a clean bucket resource name. So you have a couple options. One is if you're following like the Cloud Posse model, you start with a net new AWS organization, you Terraform up your organizational units and your accounts and so forth. Everything is pristine, but you got this legacy account with some assets in it. What we would recommend is a couple of things for customers to do. One is that you can adopt that AWS account physically into your organization, or you can metaphorically adopt it into your organization by giving your other accounts the IAM permissions to assume roles in there and modified assets and so forth. If you do that, what we also recommend is in your product, if you can start thinking about where all your new assets go, and those can flow into your new buckets, and then you can think about what to do with the other assets over time. Obviously, that'll require product changes probably in order to support multi-homed buckets. Not an unusual use case though, if you are going for GDPR or compliance situations, or you want DR capabilities. Having support for multiple buckets is a feature, And you can almost think about that legacy account, that legacy bucket, as a legacy region that you continue to support, but everything new is just going to the new accounts and so forth. I know, Jonas, you had said that you looked into a lot of tools for replicating buckets. I was just curious. I believe Amazon natively now supports that capability. Did you look into that too before that command?
No, I don't know how recently that was released, but about 6 months ago, I copied cross-region terabytes, and it was there's a ton of libraries out there that'll do it, and they're all terrible. But there is one called S3P that absolutely rips. This bioinformatics company. Which, if you don't know, bioinformatics handles some of the largest data sets in history. And they wrote this library specifically for cross-regional S3 copying. Well, that's one of the use cases anyway. And I was able to achieve, like 10, 20, 30 times reduction of time by spinning up a large EC2 instance and going out there and running this library. It absolutely rips in terms of speed. So if AWS can do it natively, that's rock and roll. In fact,
just be prepared to spend $20,000
Yeah.
in data transfer costs.
yeah. So
Yeah,
Well,
so-
that's the same no matter what.
AWS S3 API, or even the AWS CLI supports sync, where you can just have a sync between source bucket and destination bucket. That would quite literally do a bucket to bucket transfer.
right, but you could be talking like days
Yeah.
of transfer there. I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah,
literally.
it takes
you
a
could
long
even be
time.
talking weeks. You could be talking
Yes.
weeks. I mean, if you're talking like 5 petabytes of data, you could be talking weeks of transfer time.
Yes.
This thing would do that in like, 8 hours. So that's sort of the thing I want to call.
Yeah, the quickest way that I've ever been able to do that is temporarily setting up S3 bucket replication. So if you actually set up the bucket to replicate to your destination bucket, it will do it at the S3 service layer. So it doesn't even have to bring the data down to an instance and then copy it back up from another instance. It does it S3 to S3, but like that's
they can
complicated
take
to configure and get it right.
Well,
Yeah.
from what I understand too, if you want to do that historically, like for all your versions, at least the way that it used to be is you had to actually work with AWS support engineers, and it
Yes.
would take like
Yeah.
2 weeks for them to clear you because like you potentially could be like, moving tons of data. So
Yes.
Yeah, I've experienced it. Honestly, for me, it was more like 2 days when we had to do it. We had a customer that had a whole ton of like log files that were getting aggregated somewhere, and we needed to move them to another bucket. And that's what we had to do. We had to reach out to support. We turned on replication, but it took them like 2 days to give us the green light to do it. But once they did that, it flew. I mean, it was like a matter of, a few hours instead of what was going to be like 2 weeks of copying down and, up based on the path that it was going on the other way. So
The other point
it's not
there,
easy.
the other point there is, if you're going to do this and you are cost aware, also look at S3 endpoints within your VPC, and rather use those S3 endpoints rather than trying to speak to the upstream AWS S3 service.
I admit I was zoning out, so I didn't hear that. I was looking at reading the chat messages.
No worries. I can repeat that if necessary. I just said, if you're going to do this, also look at using S3 endpoints within your service rather than trying to consume the S3 public API. Like if you have a service endpoint within your VPC, it does reduce that cost also significantly.
That's true. Yeah. If you are doing this, make sure you have the VPC endpoints enabled.
Yeah.
S3. Good pro tip. Dave Gregory, were you on the call today? I know you are frequently auditing there in the background. Do not see you right now. All right. I'll let you know that you can check this. We are out of time for today, so we'll get to the rest of the questions next week. Thank you everyone for participating in our office hours. We will host this call again next week, same time, same place. If you want to register for our weekly office hours, go to cloudposse.com/office hours. Again, cloudposse.com/office hours. If you're interested in working with Cloud Posse, just head over to cloudposse.com/quiz. Again, cloudposse.com/quiz to book a session with me directly. Just answer a few quick scoping questions and we'll figure out if we're a good fit for what you need right now. Connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Osterman. Again, that's linkedin.com/in/Osterman. And look forward to seeing your posts on LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Okay, bye.
Bye.